For the next 8 or 10 months, Oliver was the victim of a systematic course of treachery and deception. He was brought up by hand. The hungry and destitute situation of the infant orphan was duly reported by the workhouse authorities to the parish authorities. The parish authorities inquired with dignity of the workhouse authorities whether there was no female then domiciled in "the house" who was in a situation to impart to Oliver Twist the consolation and nourishment of which he stood in need. The workhouse authorities replied with humility that there was not. Upon this, the parish authorities magnanimously and humanely resolved that Oliver should be farmed, or, in other words, that he should be dispatched to a branch workhouse some 3 miles off, where 20 or 30 other juvenile offenders against the poor laws rolled about the floor all day, without the inconvenience of too much food, or too much clothing, under the parental superintendence of an elderly female, who received the culprits at and for the consideration of 7 pence halfpenny per small head per week. 7 pence halfpenny's worth per week is a good round diet for a child. A great deal may be got for 7 pence halfpenny, quite enough to overload its stomach and make it uncomfortable. The elderly female was a woman of wisdom and experience. She knew what was good for children, and she had a very accurate perception of what was good for herself. So, she appropriated the greater part of the weekly stipend to her own use, and consigned the rising, parochial generation to even a shorter allowance than was originally provided for them, thereby finding in the lowest depth a deeper still, and proving herself very great experimental philosopher. Taught him everybody knows the story. Taught him everybody. Taught him everybody knows. Everybody knows the story of another experimental philosopher who had a great theory about a horse being able to live without eating, and who demonstrated it so well that he got his own horse down to a straw a day, and would most unquestionably have rendered him a very spirited and rapacious animal upon nothing at all if he hadn't died just 4 and 20 hours before he was to have had his first comfortable bait of air. Unfortunately for the experimental philosophy of the female to whose protecting care Oliver Twist was delivered over, a similar result usually attended the operation of her system, for just at the very moment when the child had contrived to exist upon the smallest possible portion of the weakest possible food, it did perversely happen, in 8.5 cases out of 10, either that it sickened from want and cold, or fell into the fire from neglect, or got smothered by accident, in any one of which cases the miserable little being was usually summoned into another world, and there gathered to the fathers which it had long known in this. Occasionally, when there was some more than usually interesting inquest upon a parish child who had been overlooked in turning up a bedstead, or inadvertently scalded to death when there happened to be a washing, though the latter accident was very scarce, anything approaching to a washing being of rare occurrence in the farm, the jury would take it into their heads to ask troublesome questions, or the parishioners would rebelliously affix their signatures to a remonstrance. But these impertinencies were speedily checked by the evidence of the surgeon and the testimony of the beadle, the former of whom had always opened the body and found nothing inside, which was very probable indeed, and the latter of whom invariably swore whatever the parish wanted, which was very self-devotional. Besides, the board made periodical pilgrimages, visits to the farm, and always sent the beadle the day before, to say they were coming. The children were neat and clean to behold when they went, and what more would the people have? cannot be expected that this system of farming would produce any very extraordinary or luxuriant crop. Oliver Twist's 8th birthday found him a pale, thin child, somewhat diminutive in stature and decidedly small in circumference. But nature, or inheritance, had implanted a good sturdy spirit in Oliver's breast. It had plenty of room to expand, thanks to the spare diet of the establishment, and perhaps to this circumstance may be attributed his having any 8th birthday at all. But this as it may, however, it was his 8th birthday, and he was keeping it in the coal cellar with a select party of 2 other young gentlemen, who, after participating with him in a sound threshing, had been locked up therein, for atrociously presuming to be hungry, when Mrs. Mann, the good lady of the house, was unexpectedly startled by the apparition of Mr. Bumble the Beetle, striving to undo the wicket of the garden gate. "Goodness gracious, is that you, Mr. Bumble, sir?" said Mrs. Mann, thrusting her head out of the window in well-affected ecstasies of joy. "Susan, take Oliver and them 2 brats upstairs and wash 'em directly. My heart alive! Mr. Bumble, how glad I am to see you, surely!" Now Mr. Bumble was a fat man and a choleric one, so instead of responding to this open-hearted salutation in a kindred spirit, he gave the little wicket a tremendous shake, and then bestowed upon it a kick which could have emanated from no leg but a beetle's. "Lor, only think," said Mrs. Mann, running out, for the 3 boys had been removed by this time, "only think of that! That I should have forgotten that the gate was bolted on the inside, on account of them dear children. Walk in, sir, walk in, pray, Mr. Bumble, do, sir." Although this invitation was accompanied with a curtsey that might have softened the heart of a churchwarden, it by no means mollified the beetle. "Do you think this respectful or proper conduct, Mrs. Mann?" inquired Mr. Bumble, grasping his cane, "to keep the parish officers awaiting at your garden gate, when they come here upon parochial business connected with the parochial orphans? Are you aware, Mrs. Mann, that you are, as I may say, a parochial delegate and a stipendiary?" "I'm sure, Mr. Bumble, that I was only a telling 1 or 2 of the dear children as is so fond of you that it was you a coming," replied Mrs. Mann with great humility. Mr. Bumble had a great idea of his humongous oratorical powers and his importance. He had displayed the one and vindicated the other. He relaxed. "Well, well, Mrs. Mann," he replied in a calmer tone, "it may be as you say, it may be. Lead the way in, Mrs. Mann, for I come on business, and have got something to say." Mrs. Mann ushered the beetle into a small parlor with a brick floor, placed a seat for him, and officiously deposited his cocked hat and cane on the table before him. Mr. Bumble wiped from his forehead the perspiration which his walk had engendered, glanced complacently at the cocked hat, and smiled. Yes, he smiled. Beetles are but men, and Mr. Bumble smiled. "Now, don't you be offended at what I'm going to say," observed Mrs. Mann with captivating sweetness. "You've had a long walk, you know, or I wouldn't mention it. Now, will you take a little drop of something, Mr. Bumble?" "Not a drop, not a drop," said Mr. Bumble, waving his right hand in a dignified but still placid manner. "I think you will," said Mrs. Mann, who had noticed the tone of the refusal, and the gesture that had accompanied it. "Just a little drop, with a little cold water and a lump of sugar." Mr. Bumble coughed. "Now just a little drop," said Mrs. Mann persuasively. "What is it?" inquired the beetle. "Why, it's what I'm obliged to keep a little of in the house, to put in the blessed infant's daffy when they ain't well, Mr. Bumble," replied Mrs. Mann as she opened a corner cupboard and took down a bottle and glass. "It's gin." "Do you give the children daffy, Mrs. Mann?" inquired Bumble, following with his eyes the interesting process of mixing. "Ah, bless 'em, that I do, dear as it is," replied the nurse. "I couldn't see 'em suffer before my very eyes, you know, sir." "No," said Mr. Bumble approvingly. "No, you could not. You are a humane woman, Mrs. Mann." Here she set down the glass. "I shall take an early opportunity of mentioning it to the board, Mrs. Mann." He drew it towards him. "You feel as a mother, Mrs. Mann." He stirred the gin and water. I drink your health with cheerfulness, Mrs. Mann." And he swallowed half of it. "And now about business," said the beadle, taking out a leathern pocket-book. "The child that was half-baptized, Oliver Twist, is 8 years old to-day." "Bless him!" interposed Mrs. Mann, unflaming her eye, inflaming her left eye with the corner of her apron. "And notwithstanding an offered reward of £10, which was afterwards increased to £20, notwithstanding the most superlative and I may say supernatural exertions on the part of this parish," said Bumble, "we have never been able to discover who is his father, or what is his mother's settlement, name, or condition." Mrs. Mann raised her hand in astonishment, but added, after a moment's reflection, "How come he to have any name at all, then?" The beadle drew himself up with great pride, and said, "I invented it." "You, Mr. Bumble?" "Aye, Mrs. Mann. We name our foundlings in alphabetical order. The last was an S. Swubble. I named him. This was T. Twist. I named him. The next one as comes will be Unwin, and the next Wilkins. I've got names ready made to the end of the alphabet, and all the way through it again when we come to Z. "Why, you're quite a literary character, sir," said Mrs. Mann. "Well, well," said the beadle, evidently gratified with the compliment. "Perhaps I may be, Mrs. Mann." He finished the gin and water, and added, "Oliver being now too old to remain here, the board have determined to have him back into the house, and I've come out myself to take him there, so let me see him at once." "I'll fetch him directly," said Mrs. Mann, leaving the room for that purpose; and Oliver, having by this time had as much of the outer coat of dirt which encrusted his face and hands removed as could be scrubbed off in one washing, was led into the room by his benevolent protectress. "Make a bow to the gentleman, Oliver," said Mrs. Mann. Oliver made a bow which was divided between the beadle on the chair and the cocked hat on the table. "Will you go along with me, Oliver?" said Mr. Bumble in a majestic voice. Oliver was about to say that he would go along with anybody with great readiness, when, glancing upwards, he caught sight of Mrs. Mann, who had got behind the beadle's chair, and was shaking her fist at him with a furious countenance. He took the hint at once, for the fist had been too often impressed upon his body not to be deeply impressed upon his recollection. "Will she go with me?" inquired poor Oliver. "No, she can't," replied Mr. Bumble, "but she'll come and see you sometimes." This was no very great consolation to the child, but, young as he was, he had sense enough to make a feint of feeling great regret at going away. It was no very difficult matter for the boy to call the tears into his eyes. Hunger and recent ill usage are great assistants if you want to cry, and Oliver cried very naturally indeed. Mrs. Mann gave him 1,000 embraces, and what Oliver wanted a great deal more, a piece of bread and butter, lest he should seem too hungry when he go up to the workhouse. With a slice of bread in his hand, and the little brown cloth parish cap upon his head, Oliver was then led away by Mr. Bumble from the wretched home where one kind word or look had never lighted the gloom of his infant years. And yet he burst into an agony of childish grief as the cottage gate closed after him. Wretched as were the little companions in misery he was leaving behind, they were the only friends he had ever known, and a sense of his loneliness in the great wide world sank into the child's heart for the first time. Mr. Bumble walked on with long strides, and little Oliver, firmly grasping his gold-laced cuff, trotted beside him, inquiring at the end of every quarter of a mile whether they were "nearly there," to which interrogations Mr. Bumble returned very brief and snappish replies, for the temporary blandness which gin and water awakens in some bosoms had by this time evaporated, and he was once again a beadle. Oliver had not been within the walls of the workhouse a quarter of an hour, and had scarcely completed the demolition of a second slice of bread, when Mr. Bumble, who had handed him over to the care of an old woman, returned, and telling him it was a board night, informed him that the board had said it was to appear before it forthwith. He was to appear. Not having a very clearly defined notion of what a live board was, Oliver was rather astounded by this intelligence, and was not quite certain whether he ought to laugh or cry. He had no time to think about the matter, however, for Mr. Bumble gave him a tap on the head with his cane to wake him up, and another on the back to make him lively, and bidding him follow, conducted him into a large whitewashed room, where 8 or 10 fat gentlemen were sitting round a table, at the top of which, seated in an armchair rather higher than the rest, was a particularly fat gentleman with a very round red face. "Bow to the board," said Bumble. Oliver brushed away 2 or 3 tears that were lingering in his eyes, and seeing no board but the table, fortunately bowed to that. "For the next 8 or 10. What's your name, boy?" said the gentleman in the high chair. For the next 8 or 10. Oliver was frightened at the sight of so many gentlemen, which made him tremble, and the beadle gave him another tap behind, which made him cry, and these 2 causes made him answer in a very low and hesitating voice, whereupon a gentleman in a white waistcoat said he was a fool, which was a capital way of raising his spirits, and putting him quite at his ease. "For the next 8 or 10 months, Oliver, boy," said the gentleman in the high chair, "listen to me. You know you're an orphan, I suppose?" "What's that, sir?" investigated poor Oliver. "The boy is a fool. I thought he was," said the gentleman in the white waistcoat in a very decided tone. "If one member of a class be blessed with an intuitive perception of others of the same race, the gentleman in the white waistcoat was unquestionably well qualified to pronounce Greek." "Hush!" said the gentleman who had spoken first. "You know you've got no father or mother, and that you were brought up by the parish, don't you?" "Yes, sir," replied Oliver, weeping bitterly. "What are you crying for?" inquired the gentleman in the white waistcoat, and to be sure it was very extraordinary. What could he be crying for? "I hope you say your prayers every night," said another gentleman in a gruff voice, "and pray for the people who feed you, and take care of you, like a Christian." "Yes, sir," stammered the boy. The gentleman who had spoke last was unconsciously right. It would have been very like a Christian, and a marvellously good Christian too, if Oliver had prayed for the people who fed and took care of him. But he hadn't. Because, well, "You've come here to be educated and taught a useful trade," said the red-faced gentleman in the high chair. "So you'll begin to pick oakum tomorrow morning at 6 o'clock," added the surly one in the white waistcoat. For the combination of both these blessings in the one simple process of picking oakum, Oliver bowed low by the direction of the beadle, and was then hurried away to a large ward, where on a rough hard bed he sobbed himself to sleep. What a noble illustration of the tender laws of this favoured country! They let the paupers go to sleep. Poor Oliver! He little thought, as he lay sleeping and happy in consciousness of all around him, that the board had the very day arrived at a decision which would exercise the most material influence over all his future fortunes. But they had, and this was it. The members of this board were very sage, deep, philosophical men, and when they came to turn their attention to the workhouse they found out at once what ordinary folks would never have discovered. The poor people liked it. It was a regular place of public entertainment for the poorer classes, a tavern where there was nothing to pay, a public breakfast, dinner, tea, and supper all the year round, a brick-and-mortar Elysium where it was all play and no work, "Oh-ho," said the board, looking very knowing, "we're the fellows to set this to rights. We'll stop it all in no time." So they established the rule that all poor people should have the alternative, for they would compel nobody, not they, of being starved by a gradual process in the house, or by a quick one out of it. With this view, they contracted with the waterworks to lay on an unlimited supply of water, and with the corn factors to supply periodically small quantities of Somea, and issued 3 meals of thin gruel a day, with an onion twice a week, and half a roll on Sundays. They made a great many other wise and humane regulations having reference to the ladies, which it is not necessary to repeat. Kindly undertook to divorce poor married people, in consequence of the great expense of a suit in Doctors' Commons, and, instead of compelling a man to support his family, as they had theretofore done, took his family away from him and made him a bachelor. There's no telling how many applicants for relief under these last two heads would not have started up in all classes of society if it had not been coupled with the workhouse. But they were long-headed men, and they had provided for this difficulty. The relief was inseparable from the workhouse and the gruel, and that frightened people. For the first 3 months after Oliver Twist was removed, the system was in full operation. It was rather expensive at first, in consequence of the increase in the undertaker's bill, and the necessity of taking in the clothes of all the paupers which fluttered loosely on their wasted, shrunken forms after a week or two's gruel. But the number of workhouse inmates got thin, as well as the paupers, and the boards were in ecstasies. The room in which the boys were fed was a large stone hall with a copper at one end, out of which the master, dressed in an apron for the purpose, and assisted by 1 or 2 women, ladled the gruel at meal times, of which composition each boy had one porringer, and no more, except on festive occasions, and then he had 2 ounces and a quarter of bread beside. The bowls never wanted washing. The boys polished them with their spoons till they shone again, and when they had performed this operation, which never took very long, the spoons being nearly as large as the bowls, they would sit staring at the copper with such eager eyes as if they could devour the very bricks of which it was composed, employing themselves meanwhile in sucking their fingers most assiduously, with a view of catching up any stray splashes of gruel that might have been cast thereon. Boys have generally excellent appetites. Oliver Twist and his companions suffered the tortures of slow starvation for 3 months. At last they got so voracious and wild with hunger that one boy, who was tall for his age, and hadn't been used to that sort of thing, for his father had kept a small cook shop, hinted darkly to his companions that unless he had another basin of gruel per diem, he was afraid he should come one night to eat the boy who slept next him, who happened to be a weakly youth of tender age. He had a wild, hungry eye, and they implicitly believed him. A council was held. Lots were cast. Who should walk up to the master after supper that evening and ask for more? And it fell to Oliver Twist. The evening arrived. The boys took their places. The master in his cook's uniform stationed himself at the copper. His pauper assistants ranged themselves behind him. The gruel was served out, and a long grace was said over the short commons. The gruel disappeared, and the boys whispered each other and winked at Oliver, while his next neighbors nudged him. Child as he was desperate with hunger and reckless with misery. He rose from the table and, advancing, basin and spoon in hand, to the master said, somewhat alarmed at his own temerity, "Please, sir, I want some more." The master was a fat, healthy man, but he turned very pale. He gazed in stupefied astonishment at the small rebel for some seconds, and then clung for support to the copper. The assistants were paralyzed with wonder, and the boys with fear. "What?" said the master at length in a faint voice. "Please, sir," replied Oliver, "I want some more." The master aimed a blow at Oliver's head with the ladle, pinioned him in his arms, and shrieked aloud for the beetle. The board were sitting in solemn conclave when Mr. Bumble rushed into the room in great excitement, and addressing the gentleman in the high chair, said, "Mr. Limbkins, I beg your pardon, sir. Oliver Twist has asked for more." There was a general start. Horror was depicted on every countenance. "For more?" said Mr. Limbkins. "Compose yourself, Bumble, and answer me distinctly. Do I understand that he asked for more after he had eaten the supper allotted by the dietary?" "He did, sir," replied Bumble. "That boy will be hung," said the gentleman in the white waistcoat. "I know that boy will be hung." Nobody controverted the prophetic gentleman's opinion. An animated discussion took place. Oliver was ordered into instant confinement, and a bill next morning pasted on the outside of the grace. Pasted outside on the gate. Pasted on the outside of the gate. Offering a reward of £5 to anybody who would take Oliver Twist off the hands of the parish. In other words, £5 and Oliver Twist were offered to any man or woman who wanted an apprentice to any trade, business, or calling. "I never was more convinced of anything in my life," said the gentleman in the white waistcoat as he knocked at the gate and read the bill next morning. "I never was more convinced of anything in my life than I am that boy will come to be hung. As I propose to show in the sequel, whether the white waistcoated gentleman was right or not, I should perhaps mar the interest of this narrative, supposing it to possess any at all, if I venture to hint just yet whether the life of Oliver Twist will be a long or a short piece of biography. "And so it was you that was your own friend, was it?" asked Mr. Claybell, otherwise Bolter, when, by virtue of the compact entered into between them, he had removed next day to the slave's house. "Cod, I thought as much last night." "Every man's his own friend," replied the captain. "Some conjurers say that number 3 is the magic number, and some say number 7. It's neither, my friend, neither. It's number 1. cried Mr. Bolter. "Number 1 forever." "In a little community like ours," said the slave, who felt it necessary to qualify this position, "we have a general number 1. That is, you can't consider yourself as number 1 without considering me too as the same, and all the other young people." "Oh, the devil!" exclaimed Mr. Bolter. "You see," pursued the slave, affecting to disregard this interruption, "we're so mixed up together and identified in our interests that it must be so. For instance, it's your object to take care of number 1, meaning yourself." "Certainly," replied Mr. Bolter. "You're about right there." "Well, you can't take care of yourself, number 1, without taking care of me, number 1. "Number 2, you mean," said Mr. Bolter, who was largely endowed with the quality of selfishness. "No, I don't," retorted the slave. "I'm of the same importance to you as you are to yourself." "I say," interrupted Mr. Bolter, "you're a very nice man, and I'm very fond of you, but we ain't quite so thick together as all that comes to." "Only think," said the slave, shrugging his shoulders and stretching out his hands. "Only consider. You've done what's a pretty thing, and what I love you for doing, but what at the same time would put the cravat round your throat that's so very easily tied, and so very difficult to unloosen. In plain English, the halter." Mr. Balter put his hand to his neckerchief, as if he felt it inconveniently tight, and murmured an assent, qualified in tone, but not in substance. "The gallows," continued the captain, "the gallows, my dear, is an ugly finger-post, which points out a very short and sharp turning that has stopped many a bold fellow's career on the broad highway. To keep in the easy road, and keep it at a distance, is object number 1 with you." "Of course it is," replied Mr. Bolter. "What do you talk about such things for?" "Only to show you my meaning clearly," said the slave, raising his eyebrows. "To be able to do that, you depend upon me. To keep my little business all snug, I depend upon you. The first is your number 1, the second my number 1. The more you value your number 1, the more carefully you must be of mine. So we come at last to what I told you at first, that a regard for number 1 holds us all together, and must do so, unless we would all go to pieces in company." "That's true," rejoined Mr. Bolter thoughtfully. "Oh, you're a cunning old codger." Mr. Fagin saw with delight that this tribute to his powers was no mere compliment, that he had really impressed his recruit with a sense of his wily genius, which it was most important that he should entertain in the outset of their acquaintance. To strengthen an impression so desirable and useful, he followed up the blow by acquainting him in some detail with the magnitude and extent of his operations, blending truth and fiction together as best served his purpose, and bringing both to bear with so much art that Mr. Bolter's respect visibly increased, and became tempered at the same time with a degree of wholesome fear which it was highly desirable to awaken. "It's this mutual trust we have in each other that consoles me under heavy losses," said the slave. "My best hand was taken from me yesterday morning." "What, I suppose he was—" "Wanted," interposed the slave. "Yes, he was wanted." "Very particular?" inquired Mr. Bolter. "No," replied the slave, "not very. He was charged with attempting to pick a pocket, and they found a silver snuff box on him. His own, my dear, his own, for he took snuff himself and was very fond of it. They remanded him till to-day, for they thought they knew the owner. Ah! He was worth 50 boxes, and I'd give the price of as many." "Prife? Pride? Of wife? Of as many? To have him back. You should have known the Dodger, my dear. You should have known the Dodger." "Well, but I shall know him, I hope. Don't you think so?" said Mr. Bolter. "I'm doubtful about it," replied the slave with a sigh. "If they don't get any fresh evidence, it'll only be a summary conviction, and we shall have him back again after 6 weeks or so. But if they do, it's a case of laggin'. They know what a clever lad he is. He'll be a lifer. They'll make the Artful nothing less than a lifer." "What do you mean by laggin' and a lifer?" demanded Mr. Bolter. "What's the good of talking in that way to me? Why don't you speak so as I can understand you?" The captain was about to translate these mysterious expressions into the vulgar tongue, and being interpreted, Mr. Bolter would have been informed that they represented that combination of words, transportation for life, when the dialogue was cut short by the entry of someone or whoever, with his hands in his breeches pockets, and his face twisted into a look of semi-comical woe. "It's all up, Captain," said whoever it was, when he and his new companion had been made known to each other. "What do you mean?" asked the slave with trembling lips. "They found the gentleman as owns the box. 2 or 3 more's a comin' to identify him, and the Artful's booked for a passage out," replied whomever. "I must have a full suit of mournin', Captain, and a hatband to visit him in, afore he sets out upon his travels. To think of Jack Dawkins, Lummy Jack, the Dodger, the Artful Dodger, goin' abroad for a common 2-penny halfpenny sneeze box! I never thought he'd have done it under a gold watch, chain, seals at the lowest. Oh, why didn't he rob some rich old gentleman of all his valuables and go out as a gentleman, and not like a common prig, without no honor, no glory?" With this expression of feeling for his unfortunate friend, whoever he was, sat himself on the nearest chair with an aspect of chagrin and despondency. "What do you talk about his having neither honor nor glory for?" exclaimed the captain, darting an angry look at his pupil. "Wasn't he always top sawyer among you all? Is there one of you that could touch him, or come near him, on any scent, eh?" "Not one," replied Master Bates, in a voice rendered husky by red cabaret regrets. "Not one." "Then what do you talk of?" replied the slave, angrily. "What are you blubbering for?" "'Cause it isn't on the record, is it?" said Charlie, chafed into perfect defiance of his venerable friend by the current of his regrets. "'Cause it can't come out in the indictment. 'Cause nobody will never know half of what he was. How will he stand in the Newgate calendar? Perhaps not be there at all. Oh, my eye, what a blow it is!" cried the Jew. "Oh, slave," extending his right hand and turning it to Mr. Bolter in a fit of chuckling which shook him as though he had the palsy. "See what a pride they take in their profession, my dear. Isn't it beautiful?" Mr. Bolter nodded assent, and the slave, after contemplating the grief of Charlie Bates for some seconds with evident satisfaction, stepped up to that young gentleman and patted him on the shoulder. "Never mind, Charlie," said the captain, soothingly. "It'll come out. It'll be sure to come out. They'll all know what a clever fellow he was. He'll show it himself, and not disgrace his old pals and teachers. Think how young he is, too. What a distinction, Charlie, to be lagged at his time of life." "Well, it is an honor, that is," said Charlie, a little consoled. "We shall have all he wants," continued the slave. "He shall be kept in the stone jug, Charlie, like a gentleman, with his beer every day and money in his pockets to pitch and toss with, if he can't spend it." "No. Shall he, though?" cried Charlie Bates. "Ah, that he shall," replied the slave, "and we'll have a big wig, Charlie, one that's got the greatest gift of the gab, to carry on his defense. And he shall make a speech for himself, too, if he likes, and we'll read it all in the papers. 'Artful dodger, shrieks of laughter, here the court was convulsed,' eh, Charlie, eh?" laughed Master Bates. "What a lark that would be, wouldn't it, Captain? I say, how the Artful would bother him, wouldn't he?" "Would!" cried the slave. "He shall. He will." "Ah, to be sure, so he will," repeated Charlie, rubbing his hands. "I think I see him now," cried the slave, bending his eyes upon his pupil. "So do I," cried Charlie Bates. "So do I. I see it all before me. Upon my soul I do, Captain. What a game! What a regular game! All the bigwigs trying to look solemn, and Jack Dawkins dressing him as intimate and comfortable as if he was the judge's own son, making a speech after dinner." In fact, the slave had so well humored his young friend's eccentric disposition that Master Bates, who had at first been disposed to consider the imprisoned Dodger rather in the light of a victim, now looked upon him as the chief actor in a scene of most uncommon and exquisite humor, and felt quite impatient for the arrival of the time when his old companion should have so favorable an opportunity of displaying his abilities. "We must know how he gets on today, by some handy means or other," said the captain. "Let me think." "Shall I go?" asked Charlie. "Not for the world," replied the slave. "Are you mad, my dear, stark mad, that you'd walk into the very place where—" "No, Charlie, no. One is enough to lose at a time." "You don't mean to go yourself, I suppose?" said Charlie, with a humorous leer. "That wouldn't quite fit," replied the captain, shaking his head. "Then why don't you send this new cove?" asked Master Bates, laying his hand on Noah's arm. "Nobody knows him." "Why, if he didn't mind," observed the slave. "Mind?" interposed Charlie. "What should he have to mind?" "Really nothing, my dear," said the captain, turning to Mr. Bolter. "Really nothing." "Oh, I dare say about that, you know," observed Noah, backing towards the door and shaking his head with a kind of sober alarm. "No, no, none of that. It's not in my department, that isn't." "What department has he got, Captain?" inquired Master Bates, surveying Noah's lanky form with much disgust. "The cutting away when there's anything wrong, and the eating all the victuals when everything's right. Is that his branch?" "Never mind," retorted Mr. Bolter, "and don't you take your liberties with your superiors, little boy, or you'll find yourself in the wrong shop." Master Bates laughed so vehemently at this magnificent threat that it was some time before Fagin, the captain, could interpose and represent to Mr. Bolter that he incurred no possible danger in visiting the police office, that, inasmuch as no account of the little affair in which he had been engaged, nor any description of his person, had not even suspected of having resorted to it for shelter, and that if he were properly disguised it would be as safe a spot for him to visit as any in London, inasmuch as it would have been a place the very last to which he could be supposed like to reserve his own free will. Persuaded, in part by these representations, but overborne in a much greater degree by his fear of the slave, Mr. Bolter at length consented, with a very bad grace, to undertake the expedition. By Fagin's directions, he immediately substituted for his own attire a waggoner's frock, velveteen breeches, and leather leggings, all of which articles the slave had at hand. He was likewise furnished with a felt hat, well garnished with turnpike tickets, and a carter's whip. Thus equipped, he was to saunter into the office as some country fellow from Covent Garden Market might be supposed to do for the gratification of his curiosity, and as he was as awkward, ungainly, and raw-boned a fellow as need be, the poem had no fear, fact, or fiction. These arrangements completed, he was informed of the necessary signs and tokens by which to recognize the artful dodger, and conveyed by Master Bates through dark and winding ways to within a very short distance of Bow Street. Having described the precise situation of the office, and accompanied it with copious directions how he was to walk straight up the passage, and, when he got into the yard, take the door up the steps on the right-hand side, and pull off his hat as he went into the room, Charley Bates bade him hurry on alone, and promised to bide his return on the spot of their parting. Noah Claypole, or Morris Bolter, as the reader pleases, punctually followed the directions he had received, which, Master Bates, being pretty well acquainted with the locality, were so exact that he was enabled to gain the magisterial presence without asking any question, or meeting with any interruption by the way. He found himself jostled among a crowd of people, chiefly women, who were huddled together in a dirty, frowsy room, at the upper end of which was a raised platform, railed off from the rest, with a dock for the prisoners on the left hand against the wall, a box for the witnesses in the middle, and a desk for the magistrates on the right. The awful locality last named being screened off by a partition which concealed the bench from the common gaze, and left the vulgar to imagine, if they could, the full majesty of justice. There were only a couple of women in the dock, who were nodding to their admiring friends, while the clerk read some depositions to a couple of policemen, and a man in plain clothes who leant over the table. A jailer stood reclining against the dock rail, tapping his nose listlessly with a large key, except when he repressed an undue tendency to conversation among the idlers by proclaiming silence or looking sternly up to bid some women take that baby out, when the gravity of justice was disturbed by feeble cries, half smothered in the mother's shawl, from some meagre infant. The room smelt close and unwholesome. The walls never shut on the British Empire, on topsoil, Excalibur. Blacky old smoke bust over the mantel-shelf, and a dusty clock above the dock, the only thing present that seemed to go on as it ought, for depravity or poverty or a habitual acquaintance with both had left a taint on all the animate matter, hardly less unpleasant than the thick greasy scum on every inanimate object that frowned upon it. Noah looked eagerly about him for the dodger, but although there were several women who would have done very well for that distinguished character's mother or sister, and more than one man who might be supposed to bear a strong resemblance to his father, nobody at all answering the description given him of the whole was to be seen. He waited in a state of much suspense, and uncertain tense, until the women, being committed for trial, went flaunting out, and then was quickly revealed by the appearance of another prisoner, whom he felt at once could be no other than the object of his visit. It was indeed Mr. Dawkins, who, shuffling into the office with the big coat sleeves tucked up as usual, his left hand in his pocket and his hat in his right, preceded the jailer with a rolling gait altogether indescribable, and taking his place in the dock, requested in an audible voice to know what he was placed in that ere disgraceful habitation for. "Hold your tongue, will you?" said the jailer. "I'm an Englishman, ain't I?" rejoined the dodger. "Where are my privileges?" "You'll get your privileges soon enough," retorted the jailer, "and pepper 'em with 'em. "We'll see what the Secretary of State for Home Affairs has got to say to the beaks, if I don't," replied Mr. Dawkins. "Now then, what is this your business? I shall thank the magistrate to dispose of this little affair, and not to keep me while they read the paper, for I've got an appointment with the gentleman in the city, and as I'm a man of my word and very punctual in business matters, he'll go away if I ain't there in no time, and then perhaps there won't be any extra from damage against them as go my way. Oh no, certainly not." At this point the dodger, with a show of being very particular with a view to proceedings to be had thereafter, desired the jailer to communicate the names of them two old fowls as was on the bench, which was so tickled at this point The Dodger, with a show of being very particular with a view to proceedings to be had thereafter, desired the gaoler to communicate the names of them old files as was on the bench, which so tickled the spectators that they laughed almost as heartily as Master Bates could have been done if he had heard the request. "Silence there!" cried the gaoler. "What is this?" inquired one of the magistrates. "A pickpocketing case, your worship. Has that boy ever been here before?" "He ought to have been many a times," replied the gaoler. "He has been pretty well everywhere else." "I know him well, your worship." "Oh, you know me, do you?" cried the artful, making a note of the statement. "Very good. That's a case of deformation of character, anyway." Here there was another laugh and another cry of "Silence." "Now then, where are the witnesses?" said the clerk. "Ah, that's right," added the Dodger. "Where are they? I should like to see them." This wish was immediately gratified, for a policeman stepped forward who had seen the prisoner attempt the pocket of an unknown gentleman in a crowd, and indeed take a handkerchief therefrom, which, being a very old one, he deliberately put back again, after trying it on his own countenance. For this reason he took the Dodger into custody as soon as he could get near him, and the said Dodger, being searched, had upon his person a silver snuff-box, with the owner's name engraved upon the lid. This gentleman had been discovered on reference to the court guide, and being then and there present, swore that the snuff-box was his, and that he had missed it on the previous day, the moment he had disengaged himself from the crowd before referred to. He had also remarked a young gentleman in the throng particularly active in making his way about, and that young gentleman was the prisoner before him. "Have you anything to ask this witness, boy?" asked the darling magistrate. "I wouldn't abase myself by descending to hold any conversation with him," replied the Dodger, "that night in an exceptional dream." "Have you anything to say at all?" "Do you hear his worship ask if you've anything to say?" inquired Mr. Fagin, nudging the silent Dodger with his elbow. "I beg your pardon," said Mr. Dawkins was to be seen, looking up with an air of abstraction. "Did you address yourself to me, my man?" "I never see such an out-and-out young vagabond, your worship," observed the officer with a grin. "Do you mean to say anything, you young shaver?" "No," replied the Dodger, "not here, for this ain't the shop for justice. Besides which, my attorney is breakfasting this morning with the Vice President of the House of Commons. But I shall have something to say elsewhere, and so will he, and so will a very numerous and respectable circle of acquaintances will make them beaks wish they'd never been born, or that they'd got their footmen to hang 'em up to their own hat pegs afore they let 'em come out this morning to try it out upon me. I'll—" "There, he's fully committed," interposed the clerk. "Take him away." "Come on," said the gaoler. I'll come on," replied the Dodger, brushing his hat with the palm of his hand. "Ah!" to the bench. It's no use. You're looking frightened. I won't show you no mercy. Not a half porth of it. You'll pay for this, my fine fellow. I wouldn't be you for son. I wouldn't go free. No, if you was to fall down your knee, ask me here, Gary, get me out of prison, take me away. With these last words, the Dodger suffered himself to be led off by the collar, threatening till he got into the yard to make a parliamentary business of it, and then grinning in the officer's face with great glee and self-approval. Having seen him locked up by himself in a little cell, Noah made the best of his way back to where he had left Master Bates. After waiting here some time, he was joined by that young gentleman who had prudently abstained from showing himself until he had looked carefully abroad from a snug retreat, and ascertained that his new friend had not been followed by any impertinent person. The two hastened back together to bear to the poem the animating news that the Dodger was doing full justice to his bringing up, and establishing for himself a glorious reputation. In great families, talking in one's sleep, out of turn, either in possession, reversion, remainder, or expectancy, for the young man who is growing up, it is a very general custom to send him to sea. The board, in imitation of so wise and salutary an example, took counsel together on the expediency of shipping off Oliver Twist in some small trading vessel, bound to a good unhealthy port, which suggested itself as the very best thing that could possibly be done with him, the probability being that the skipper would either flog him to death in a playful mood some day after dinner, or knock his brains out with a Jefferson barbell, both pastimes being, as is pretty generally known, very favourite and common recreations among gentlemen of that class. The more the case presented itself to the board in this point of view, the more manifold the advantages of the step appeared, so they came to the conclusion that the only way of providing for Oliver effectually was to send him to sea without delay. Mr. Bloom, with his stick, gently vexed the thick sand at his foot. Write a message for her. Might remain. What? I. Some flat-foot tramp on it in the morning. Useless. Washed away. Tide comes here, a pool near her foot. Bend. See my face there. Dark mirror. Breathe on it. Stirs. All these rocks with lines and scars and letters. Oh, those transparent. Besides, they don't know. What is the meaning of that other world? I called you naughty boy because I do not like am a no room. Let it go. Mr. Bloom effaced the letters with his slow boot. Hopeless thing, sand. Nothing grows in it. All fades. No fear of big vessels coming up here, except Guinness's barges, round the Kish in 80 days, done half by design. He flung his wooden pen away. The stick fell in silted sand, stuck. Now, if you were trying to do that for a week on end, you couldn't. Chance. We'll never meet again. But it was lovely. Good-bye, dear. Thanks. Made me feel so young. Short snooze now if I had. Must be near 9. Liverpool boat long gone. Not even the smoke. And she can do the other. Did, too. And Belfast. I won't go. Race there. Race back to Ennis. Let him. Just close my eyes a moment. Won't sleep, though, half dream. It never comes the same. Bad again. No harm in 'em. Just a few. Oh, sweetie, all your little girl white up I saw. Dirty. Brace griddle. Made me do love. Sticky. We two. Naughty Grace. Darling. She him half. Past the bed. Met him. Pike, hoses, frillies for Raoul to perfume your wife, black hair, heave, under Eamon. Senorita, Young eyes, movie, plump years, dreams, return, tail end, Agendath, love for who is there, who anything of some significance has apprehended, but is conscious that the exterior splendor may be the surface of a downward tending luxuriant reality, or, on the contrary, any one so is there illuminated as not to perceive that as no nature's boon can contend against the bounty of increase, so it behooves every most just citizen to become the exhortator and admonisher of his semblables, and to tremble lest what had in the past been by the nation excellently commenced might be in the future not traduced. The honourable by ancestors transmitted customs to that thither of profundity, that one was audacious excessively, who will have the with similar excellence accomplished, if in an invercund habit shall have gradually hardihood deserving, odious quickening. Tea and soda bread and butter and fried mutton chops with catsup and talking about cuckoo, 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 because it was a little canary bird that came out of its little house to tell the time that Gertie McDowell noticed the time she was there because she was as quick as anything about a thing like that, was Gertie McDowell, and she no, no, noticed at once that that foreign gentleman that was sitting on the rocks looking was cuckoo, cuckoo, cuckoo. Part was impelling on of her to be received into that domicile. O thing of prudence, nation, not merely in being seen, but also even in being related worthy of being praised, that they her by anticipation went seeing mother, that she by them suddenly to be about to be cherished had been begun she felt, before born babe bliss had, within womb one he worship, whatever in that one case done commodiously done was, a couch by midwives attended with wholesome food, reposefully clean as swaddles, as though forth-bringing were now done and by wise foresight set. But to these no less of what drugs there is need, and surgical implements which are pertaining to her case, not omitting aspect of all very distracting spectacles in various latitudes, by our terrestrial orb, offer together with images divine and human the cognition, cogitation, of which by Squire Trelawney, Dr. Livesey, and the rest of these gentlemen, having asked me to write down the whole particular about Treasure Island, from the beginning to the end, keeping nothing back but the bearings of the island, and that only because there is still treasure not yet lifted, I take up my pen in the year of grace 17 blah blah blah, and go back to the time when my father kept the Admiral Benbow Inn, and the brown old seaman with a sabre cut first took up his lodging under our roof. I remember him as if it were yesterday, and he came plodding to the inn door, his sea chest following behind him in a hand barrow, a tall, strong, heavy, nut brown man, his tarry pigtail falling over the shoulders of his soiled blue coat, his hands ragged and scarred with black broken nails, and the sabre cut across one cheek a dirty livid white. I remember him looking round the cove and whistling to himself as he did so, and then breaking out in that old sea song that he sang so often afterwards. 15 men on the dead man's chest. Mr. Bumble had been best dispatched to make various preliminary inquiries with the view of finding out some captain or other who wanted a cabin boy without any friends, and was returning to the workhouse to communicate the result of his mission, when he encountered just at the gates no less a person than Mr. Sowerberry, the parochial undertaker. Mr. Sowerberry was a tall, gaunt, large-jointed man, attired in a suit of threadbare black, with darned cotton stockings of the same color, and shoes to answer. His features were not naturally intended to wear a smiling aspect, but he was in general rather given to professional jocosity. His step was elastic, and his face betokened inward pleasantry, as he advanced to Mr. Bumble and shook him cordially by the hand. "I've taken the measure of the 2 women that died last night, Mr. Bumble," said the undertaker. "You'll make your fortune, Mr. Sowerberry," said the beadle, as he thrust his thumb and forefinger into the proffered snuff-box of the undertaker, which was an ingenious little model of a patent coffin. "I say you'll make your fortune, Mr. Sowerberry," repeated Mr. Bumble, tapping the undertaker on the shoulder in a friendly manner with his cane. "Think so?" said the undertaker in a tone which half admitted and half disputed the probability of the event. "The prices allowed by the board are very small, Mr. Bumble." "So are the coffins," replied the beadle, with precisely as near an approach to a laugh as a great official ought to indulge in. Mr. Sowerberry was much tickled at this, as of course he ought to be, and laughed a long time without cessation. "Well, well, Mr. Bumble," he said at length, "there's no denying that, since the new system of feeding has come in, the coffins are something narrower and more shallow than they used to be, but we must have some profit, Mr. Bumble. Well-seasoned timber is an expensive article, sir, and all the iron handles come by canal from Birmingham." "Well, well," said Mr. Bumble, "every trade has its drawbacks, and a fair profit is of course allowable." Of course," replied the undertaker, "and if I don't get a profit upon this or that particular article, why, I make it up in that long run, you see." "Just so," said Mr. Bumble. "Though I must say," continued the undertaker, resuming the current of observation which the beadle had interrupted, "though I must say, Mr. Bumble, that I have to contend against one very great disadvantage, which is, that all the stout people go off the quickest. I mean that the people who have been better off, and have paid rates for many years, are the first to sink when they come into the house. And let me tell you, Mr. Bumble, that 3 or 4 inches over one's calculation makes a Bethlehem in one's profits, especially when one has a family to provide for, sir." As Mr. Sowerberry said this with the becoming indignation of an ill-used man, and as Mr. Bumble felt that it rather tended to convey a reflection on the honour of the parish, the latter gentleman thought it advisable to change the subject, and Oliver Twist being uppermost in his mind, he made him his theme. "By the by," said Mr. Bumble, "you don't know anybody who wants a boy, do you? A parochial apprentice, who is at present a dead weight, a millstone, as I may say, round the parochial throat?" "Liberal terms, Mr. Sowerberry, liberal terms." And as Mr. Bumble spoke, he raised his cane to the bill above him, and gave 3 distinct raps upon the words £5, which were printed therein in Roman capitals of gigantic size. "God, so," said the undertaker, taking Mr. Bumble by the gilt-edged lapel of his official coat, "that's just the very thing I wanted to speak to you about. You know, dear me, what a very elegant button this is, Mr. Bumble. I never noticed it before." "Yes, I think it is rather pretty," said the beadle, glancing proudly downwards at the large brass buttons which embellished his coat. "The die is the same as the parochial seal, the Good Samaritan healing the sick and bruised man. The board presented it to me on New Year's morning, Mr. Sowerberry. I put it on, I remember, for the first time, to attend the inquest on that reduced tradesman who died in a doorway at midnight." "I recollect," said the undertaker. "The jury brought in, 'Died from exposure to the cold and want of the common necessaries of life,' didn't they?" Mr. Bumble nodded. "And they made it a special verdict, I think," said the undertaker, "by adding some words to the effect that if the relieving officer had—" "Tush! Foolery!" interposed the beadle angrily. "If the board attended to all the nonsense that ignorant jurymen talk, they'd have enough to do." "Very true," said the undertaker, "they would indeed." "Juries," said Mr. Bumble, grasping his cane tightly, as was his wont when working into a passion, "juries is uneducated, vulgar, grovelling wretches." "So they are," said the undertaker. They haven't no more philosophy or political economy about 'em than that, said the beadle, snapping his fingers contemptuously. No more they have, acquiesced the undertaker. I despise 'em, said the beadle, growing very red in the face. So do I, rejoined the undertaker. And I only wish we'd a jury of the independent sort in the house for a week or two, said the beadle. The rules and regulations of the board would soon bring their spirit down for them. Let him alone for that, replied the undertaker. So saying, he smiled approvingly to calm the rising wrath of the indignant parish officer. Mr. Bumble lifted off his cocked hat, took a handkerchief from the inside of the crown, wiped from his forehead the perspiration which his rage had engendered, fixed the cocked hat on again, and turning to the undertaker, said in a calmer voice, Well, what about the boy? Oh, replied the undertaker, why, Mr. Bumble, I pay a good deal towards the poor's rates. Said Mr. Bumble. Well? Well, replied the undertaker, I was thinking that if I pay so much towards 'em, I have a right to get as much out of 'em as I can, Mr. Bumble, and so, I think I'll take the boy myself. Mr. Bumble grasped the undertaker by the arm and led him into the building. Mr. Sowerberry was closeted with the board for 5 minutes, and then it was arranged that Oliver should go with him. To him. That evening, upon liking, a phrase which means, in the case of a parish apprentice, that if the matter find, upon a short trial, that he can get enough work out of a boy without putting too much food in him, he shall have him for a term of years, to do what he likes with. When little Oliver was taken before the gentleman, that evening, and informed that he was to go that night, as general house lad, to a coffin-maker's, and that if he complained of his situation, or ever came back to the parish again, he would be sent to sea, there to be drowned, or knocked on the head, as the case might be, he evinced so little emotion, that they may be common consent pronouncing him a pardoned young rascal, and ordered Mr. Bumble to remove him forthwith. Now, although it was very natural that the board, of all the people in the world, should feel in a great state of virtuous astonishment and horror at the smallest tokens of want of feeling on the part of anybody, they were rather out in this particular instance. The simple fact was that Oliver, instead of possessing too little feeling, possessed rather too much, and was in a fair way of being reduced to a state of brutal stupidity and sullenness for life, by the ill usage he had received. He heard the news of his destination in perfect silence, and having had his luggage put into his hand, which was not very difficult to carry, inasmuch as it was all comprised within the limits of a brown paper parcel about half a foot square by 3 inches deep, he pulled his cap over his eyes, and once more attaching himself to Mr. Bumble's coat cuff, was led